Hello and welcome to episode 13 of Texas Tracks and Taps. My name is John.
I'm
And
Coy. And I'm Graham.
And welcome to another exciting episode. This week, we're continuing a sequence that we've been following the past couple of episodes on specific years. And Coy, you picked this week's year of 1969. So we are going to go through that tumultuous year. There was a lot going on that year, but a lot of excellent, fine music to go with it as well. But before we actually get everything kicked off, we always want to understand what we're wetting our lips with this week. So, Graham, what are we drinking this week when it comes to beer?
Yeah, thanks, John. We are enjoying beer from the Spoetzl Brewery, otherwise known as Shiner Beer. Shiner started out in 1909 in Shiner, Texas. It was started by immigrants from Germany and the Czech Republic. And they got there and settled and were like, well, we need a brewery, of course, they're being from those countries, it makes sense. So they started a brewery and, just for the community basically at that time. And then 1914, this was 1909. I don't know if I mentioned that, but 1914, they brought on the head brewer, Cosmos Spoetzl, and he ended up actually purchasing the brewery. And that's why it's known as the Spoetzl Brewery to this day. But yeah, to me, it's kind of the flagship beer of Texas, I would say. I think everybody kind of recognizes Shiner throughout the state as being identified with Texas specifically, although they do distribute out of state as well, and they're all over the place now. But for a long time, it was just a local brewery. But I, myself, am enjoying Ruby Redbird, which is it's the summer and spring beer. It's been one of my favorites for a while during those seasons. It's very light and crisp, but it's got a hint of grapefruit and a little bit of ginger. And it's really delicious. So what are you guys drinking?
Yeah, I grabbed Shiner Black Lager, sometimes just called Shiner Black. I love a good black lager, and while I love their flagship, Bock beer, this is a great one. It's right up there with it for me. And then wanted to grab Shiner Blonde because that's actually kind of the original Shiner recipe. If you want to find that today, 100 years later, that's the closest to what they were originally making when it was the Shiner Brewers Association in Shiner, Texas, that later became Spoetzl Brewery. And then, of course, the Bock is the other one that's kind of been around for almost as long as that one. So. But yeah, that's what I went with for today.
So I actually, as my second beer, I do have the blonde.
You got the blonde for your second beer.
Yeah, I'll really call it the light blonde now. To it because it's only got 99 calories and very tasty at 99 calories. I will say that
for sure.
I can't lie, guys. I'm going to have to come clean to the public like I've already come clean to the two of you, but I'm trying a little experiment over the next couple of weeks, and I've cut out a couple things in my diet, which impedes this podcast. One of them is gluten and one is dairy. And it's just a little personal experience, no allergies or anything like that, just trying to see how I feel and if it actually does a little something good, positive for my body. So I am still drinking beer, but I am drinking gluten-free beer, and I'm hunting, and I'd love listeners to, please comment on this. If there's any gluten-free beers that you are fans of, especially if they're Texas-based, I'd love to try them. So my first go at the store, I was really limited in what I could pick up. So I'm trying today a Belgian beer called Greens Amber, and then I've got Holiday Brewing out of Colorado. So I'm really hunting for some Texas gluten-free beers. The interwebs told me that there are some out there, but hopefully I'll be able to find some for the next episode.
How's the experiment going? How are you feeling, John?
I feel good. I mean, I feel like I've got energy. I don't feel sluggish. I think really dairy has been the thing that's been my killer. I was kind of chatting about that earlier where I love cheese. It's like one of my major vices besides beer. But yeah, I'm just trying to get a little bit on a health kick and see how it makes me feel. But hopefully it's not going to be long term. I'm just going to do it short term to see how I do and maybe ease back into beer.
Awesome. Well, cheers, guys.
Cheers. Cheers.
Cheers.
Yeah, we can jump in, start talking about why I chose the year 1969. You guys have picked great years that we were alive for, and even if we were a little younger, but still very much have memories of those years, whereas none of us were going to have any firsthand memories of 1969. But I think it did influence a lot of the people in our lives that probably influenced us when we talk about our origin stories in our origin episode. Also certainly influenced a lot of the artists that we talked about in those other years. I went back and forth on a lot of years, but they were kind of all in the era of like 1965 to 1973, somewhere around there. And why I landed on 1969, there's a number of reasons, but I think it is right. I mean, it is literally right in the middle of that era. So if you're looking at the Venn diagram of like the music that was coming out in the 70s and the music that had already come out in like the mid 60s, it's right there kind of on both worlds, right? So I thought that was really interesting. Some of the releases that year, it's just like, what other years can you point to that had, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, the Beach Boys, all the big ones that you can think of. Plus, it's the year that David Bowie has his first song of prominence that, just happens to come out the same year that the American astronauts are landing on the moon. So he's got this song about, Space Oddity, about a astronaut. And I think the BBC had that as background music while they broadcast the moon landing. So, it goes from, he had a few other releases before this, but now he's like literally in people's homes and household name. And from there, he has the 70s, he has a great run, of course, and even into the 80s. Yeah, I just thought it was there's just so much going on. We're going to hit on all of these prominent releases. It wasn't, we say the best, but it's quotation marks. I think it's maybe just impactful more than best, because there's definitely some bad, things that happened. And it wasn't all great, but there was a lot of, the way music was going, the way the country was going, the way the world was going. You had Woodstock, and you had that same year Altamont, and it was like, the ultimate of peace and love, and then what happened to that just a few months later, where it's like, it's all going up in violence. And yeah, still a lot of violence, a very violent era. When we talked about our activism episode, a lot of songs from this time frame were mentioned because it was definitely a very tumultuous time. But as we mentioned in that episode, that usually leads to some pretty good art and music. So yeah,
great pick, Coy. Like, when you first said 1969, I was like, none of us were alive, man. Like, why? But when you start digging in and you understand like what was going on at that time, like it's crazy. The United States specifically, actually, the whole world was kind of in upheaval. You had, a lot of stuff going on here in the US. You had stuff going on in Ireland and UK, and just, all over the world, man. And, we had lots going on with the civil rights movement, the Cold War, trying to get to space and the moon. Just lots of stuff. New president, Vietnam. Yeah. Yeah. So it's just like crazy. But when you look at the music, man, you picked an excellent year. So we got a lot to talk about musically.
For sure. I think maybe we start with the Beatles, just because they are the biggest band from this era. You can argue Rolling Stones, you can argue a lot of different things, but they appear on a lot of people's lists. So they're pretty huge. This is the 1969 is the last time they perform together live publicly. And that's that rooftop concert that they did as they were recording the Let It Be album. They go out onto the rooftop of the Apple Studios, I believe, and put on that little impromptu concert. Police had to shut it down due to noise complaints, but great. If you've never seen that footage, definitely recommend it. It's really cool, but it's really, when you have the context we have now of like, man, this is the last time and everything's going to fall apart. And, this band's not going to be here in like another year. It's pretty wild. So, and that album, not my favorite Beatles album, I could have, if we were going all in on the Beatles, I wouldn't probably have picked this year, but it's still a good album. And you can't go wrong with, Come Together is a pretty big Beatles song that came out in '69. So yeah, I know there's personal lives of the Beatles too is probably what's contributed to the band not having much more life, but Paul and John both got married, Paul to Linda and John to Yoko. And of course, John and Yoko were releasing music in 1969 together. They were doing their bed-ins or whatever they called them, where they just stayed in bed in the hotel, and they're they released a Give Peace a Chance.
So
Yeah, so
not my favorite Beatles album either, but fantastic album. And I always love when George, gets his songs on the album, and he has two on that one, Come Together and Something, which is really, Something's a beautiful song.
Yes, great song.
But yeah, I mean, just front to back, that's just a every track on there could be a hit. These days, it was a great album for sure.
Yeah. And it's funny when you're like, maybe not their strongest album or not what people usually say is their favorite, but if you didn't have other Beatles albums to compare it to, and it was just that one, you'd still rant and rave over it. And people do still say it's, one of the better ones. But yeah, anything from your end on Beatles, Graham?
Well, I just think, obviously it's crazy that they released actually a second album that same year as well. Now, it was a soundtrack, but Yellow Submarine.
Yeah, that's right.
Which, again, not one of my favorite albums from them, but something different, and something kind of fun and kind of lighthearted. Went along with the whole animated, film behind it and everything. And yeah, I've always enjoyed that one. So yeah, I mean, it's just, crazy that just so much was coming out at this time. I mean, Creedence Clearwater Revival, they had 3 albums come out this year, and I don't want to steal your thunder, Floy, but I know that's probably something you were going to hit on too.
Yeah,
there was a lot to be said for John and Yoko's marriage and how that kind of contributed to probably, I mean, it might have already been happening, but it definitely, I think, fast forwarded the demise of the band in a lot of ways. I mean, if you watch any of the documentaries, about that time, it becomes pretty obvious that she was a contributor to their decline as a band. But yeah, I also wanted to plug the film by Peter Jackson that he did, which features, that rooftop concert and a lot of that footage around that. So yeah, it's called Get Back.
Yeah.
Fantastic documentary. So check that out if you haven't seen it.
Graham, you bring up an interesting point, and rather than, we'll dive into some more albums here, but Beatles releasing 2 albums, CCR releasing 3. I'm sure you're going to dive into Zepp, and there are a couple of albums. Like, it's just interesting to see how from 1969 to today, music has changed. Like that, to release 3 albums in a year is pretty unheard of these days. And, it seemed like it was commonplace to be releasing multiple albums back then by some of your top artists.
Yeah, that's what I noticed about this year. And I'm sure it's, other years in this time frame, but it seemed like this year especially that you had multiple albums from bands or artists. I know we talked about Johnny Cash also had multiple releases. Boy Named Sue, this is the year that kind of took off for him, which is one of his, greater songs that he's known for. And that came from his Live at San Quentin album, which was kind of a follow-up. He had already done the Live from Folsom album previously. So he's got live albums, there's a lot of compilations and studio albums and things like that. Everyone couldn't seem to get enough of records and music. And in this time period, it was very important so there are social and pop culture. Music was driving a lot of, everything. So it made sense that people are going to put out as many things as they can. But yeah, it's just impressive, especially Creedence Clearwater Revival putting out 3 studio albums in the same year. And then Led Zeppelin bookends the year with Led Zeppelin 1 and Led Zeppelin 2, which there's Creedence Clearwater Revival on the screen right now if you're watching the video.
Yeah.
But then honestly, Led Zeppelin was one of the reasons why it was going to be a year that they were releasing music as far as what I was going to pick. But I picked 1969 because you have them and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Even the Beach Boys are released an album. So, but yeah, and kind of speaking of the Rolling Stones, they have a pretty huge album that comes out in the year. And that's Let It Bleed. And that one, is usually in the mix of when people talk about, the best Stones albums. It's usually in the conversation. You have Gimme Shelter. Country Honk is a country version of Honky Tonk Women,
Right.
so it's like it's a different rendition. That was a song that had already been released, but it was a pretty big song for them. And then
Can't always get what you want.
Can't Always Get What You Want.
Yeah.
Thank you. The last song. So the first song and the last song from those albums are kind of the biggest two that people think of from that album. But yeah, I got into Rolling Stones much later than I got into the Beatles, but they're, I think from this era, they're the top two bands that people talk about, think about as far as, who was putting out the best music. But then you have Led Zeppelin crashing onto the scene too. So I know we went and saw the Led Zeppelin documentary a little while back, and it covered this specific era as well. But yeah, I'll let you guys talk a little bit about Led Zeppelin and these two albums in particular.
They debuted, right? They had their debut early in the year, and then they followed up with Led Zeppelin 2. And I mean, you talk about influential albums. I mean, everything we mentioned, every artist you mentioned has been influential, but I think Led Zeppelin, it's like stratospheric in terms of their influence over the past, 30, 40 years of current artists. So, just classic songs, or You Shook Me, Dazed and Confused out of those albums. I mean, it's just stellar. And yes, we just went to that movie, the documentary about Led Zeppelin, which highly recommend. It's a great documentary, but they blasted onto the scene hard. I mean, they came out of the gates just successful with both of those albums. But Graham, anything about Zeppelin that you wanted to add in? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just second and third everything y'all are saying, but yeah, I mean, you mentioned a couple of the songs, off of your debut, but then you got, Led Zeppelin 2 coming in at the end of the year with, Whole Lot of Love and Heartbreaker and Ramble On, and just, classic iconic songs that just, changed, I think, the rock landscape for many years to come, and they're still inspiring, rock and roll bands today.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you can't argue with the huge impact that was had in 1969 by Led Zeppelin. Sure.
Yeah, they're kind of birthed from these, other bands or just, the session studio musicians in England that spent most of the 60s honing their craft. And then, as they're trying to kind of put together this new super group, and ends up being Led Zeppelin, and yeah, the rest is history. So I think this year there's a lot of that of, bands are breaking up, things are changing, things are going away, but we're starting to see what the next decade's going to look like. And I think that's interesting. Of all the year episodes we've done so far, is it usually tends to be a time period of transition in music and change, and something like you're still getting things that had been the driving force, but then you're starting to get new stuff that you're going to impact the next 10 years or more. So this felt like fits right in with those conversations we've had before of just the way music was evolving. And there was so much that was released this year that could be still considered, 60s music, but was definitely the precipice of what rock would be like the next 10 years or so. And not just rock, but you have, your soul artists, and Motown had been huge in the 60s. So Diana Ross is leaving the Supremes in 1969. She releases her last album with them, but she also releases Diana Ross Presents the Jackson 5. It's the Jackson 5, but the name of it is, she's presenting them. And so this is like the new Motown. And of course, we all know how impactful the Jackson 5 and Michael Jackson are going to be for many years to come. But I will say, we were talking about, we've been picking years where we were actually alive. And I did want to pick 1984 because of, Michael Jackson, Madonna, pop, new wave, all those things that were big in the 80s, but also so I could talk about U2 because I really can't talk about U2 in the 1969 episode, but I can because I just did, and so drink because I mentioned U2.
Already drank.
You too.
Yeah.
Can't go an
I mean,
episode without.
Yeah. And just to kind of piggyback on what you're saying about soul kind of, changing and kind of coming to the forefront more so as well. I mean, Aretha had been doing her thing for a while, but she had an album in 1969 called Soul 69, featured the tracks Of My Tears and Gentle on My Mind. One critic in the Rolling Stone, he wrote that it was quite possibly the best record to appear in the last 5 years. So it was critically, very well received. Another thing he said is excellent in ways in which pop music hasn't been since the Beatles spearheaded the renaissance of rock. But yeah, it kind of sunk into obscurity. It wasn't, didn't really take off and didn't sell very well. But if you go back and actually listen to the songs on that album, I mean, it's really, really excellent. And like I said, just critics, lauded it. So I think it probably has still some huge impact, on soul artists today and, throughout the years.
Well, talking about soul, there's an album that came out in 1969 that is going to be at the top of, every all-time list. It's generally top 5. It's not maybe number 1, but Hot Buttered Soul from Isaac Hayes changed the game. And there's another documentary, I think it came out like a year or 2 ago on Stax Records. If you haven't seen it, another great music documentary to watch, but there's quite a bit on Isaac Hayes and kind of his influence and how that specific album actually changed the game in soul music and very influential afterwards. So that's another fantastic one that came out. Fifth Dimension had one that year as well. And
Marvin Gaye,
yeah. Sly and Family Stone had Stand that year. So, yeah, and we talked about political and kind of advocacy songs. Like a lot of those albums had songs on them because of the changing times and everything that's going on with the civil rights movement. A lot of statements to be made on those albums as well.
Yeah, the Harlem Cultural Festival, the one in 1969 specifically, was one that drew very large crowds. It was known as like the Black Woodstock. So Sly and the Family Stone were a big part of that, as well as Nina Simone and several, very, very influential soul artists from this time frame. There is a documentary called Summer of Soul that Questlove did that came out a few years ago. It's very, very good. I highly recommend that one. But yeah, it's another reason why I picked this year is the music festivals. There were a ton. You had, and not just in America, but also internationally. And, when you look at previous years, there's music festivals have been around. They have been a thing. They were growing in popularity. But then I don't know what happened. I know what happened. 1969, this is where the music was, where the generation was culturally. You have music festivals all over the place. And there's one in Detroit as well that was known for they featured the first punk artists who came out in 1969 as well. And John, I think you have one of the albums that we're going to talk about, but the Stooges came out with their debut album in 1969. They played that Detroit Rock Festival. And then waiting for John to pull it up here. Yeah, MC5. So it's great because you don't think about punk, but, coming from this same era of all these other music we've been talking about. But yeah, these are the guys that you start, the things that you start hearing in the 70s and into the 80s with punk is pretty much because of those two bands.
If you do not have this record in your collection, go out and buy it now.
Well, I'm recording a podcast, but maybe after.
What's interesting to me is, though, at the time that album released, it got a lot of negative kind of feedback from critics at the time. But yeah, I mean, going back now, I mean, obviously you can track how influential it was and what a monumentous album and band that they were. But yeah, at the time it wasn't received well, partially
you know
because I
why?
think it was just so different and so
Yes.
controversial.
He kicks it off. This I have 2 copies of this, guys. So there's a censored and an uncensored version. This is the censored, and so he says, "Kick out the jams, mother lover." And I think that was, when you get the uncensored version, I think
Yeah.
that's why they didn't like it. 'Cause for its time, it was pretty
Yeah.
risque.
Pushing boundaries. A lot of that was
Yes.
going on for sure.
Yeah, but I think even just from a musical standpoint, it was just so like unique and so out there that I think people were just like, "What is this?" They didn't know what to think of it at the
Yeah.
time. But I mean, yeah, it happens a lot in music where you have something come out that's just out of nowhere, and eventually it changes the game. But initially, it's not always seen as good
Well,
music.
yeah.
Anyway, I
Yeah.
will I will
Yeah,
say
that
too another thing we haven't really touched on. I'm a big alt country fan. I talk about that genre a lot, and we didn't have what you would call necessarily alt country at this time. It hadn't really been created as a genre or subgenre yet, but you did have a lot of country rock, is what they called it at the time, coming out. So just wanted to mention some of those releases. The Flying Burrito Brothers, The Gilded Place of Sin, their debut album, which featured Graham Parsons and some other guys that you would know, but a great, great, country rock album. Also, Poco released their debut album, and that one was called Picking Up the Pieces. It's really, really awesome record. Don't know that you call it country rock, more a folk rock, but obviously huge one. Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Their self-titled debut came out this year as well. And, of course, later on, Neil Young would join, CSNN and become CSNY. But Neil Young also had an excellent, excellent album come out this year.
I'm listening for the big one. Listening for the big one. Southern Rockers, Allman Brothers Band.
Oh, Allman Brothers Band, yeah, for sure.
They had their debut.
Yeah, Black Hearted Woman. What's the name of the Neil Young album? I can't find it.
Oh, this one right here?
Yeah, that one right there. Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere. Yeah, that's the one I was trying to find. Yeah, it features the songs of Everyone Knows This Is Nowhere and Cinnamon Girl and Down by the River. I mean, just great classic Neil Young songs. It's up there. Definitely, I think top 5 for me from albums that came out in 1969, even though I can't remember the name of it. But I love that record.
Yeah, one of my favorite Uncle Neil records. I think you already said the tracks, but Cinnamon Girl's fantastic. Losing End on side 2, Down by the River, of course, everybody knows that. So
it's a great one.
Yeah, great album.
I also had a way that I was going to work in YouTube, more so Bono than the band YouTube, but Frank Sinatra had an album came out in 1969. He covers the Beatles and he covers Simon and Garfunkel on it with Yesterday and Mrs. Robinson. But when it was remixed and reissued by Concord Records in 2009, and 2 bonus tracks were included, and the new liner notes were written by Bono.
Nice.
So that was how I was going to shoehorn in
and
on our YouTube, so you can drink again.
And I know that's also the year that he released My Way, I believe.
Yes.
So, he had, which is a great looking back on career retrospective song. I mean, that's one of his more, well-known songs, but it comes from this kind of, he's already passed the torch off and he's, now singing songs by the Beatles and stuff like that. So it's not his prime time, but you see a few artists like that come back in and they're doing, they do either they return to live performing like Elvis did. Elvis comes out of like semi-retirement to start a Vegas residency in 1969, but he releases Suspicious Minds as well as In the Ghetto, which are 2 songs that end up being pretty big songs for him. Speaking of Simon and Garfunkel, they released The Boxer in 1969, which is a great song. So you still have folk, doing its thing. Bob Dylan releases an album in 1969. He returns to live performance after a motorcycle accident at the Isle of Wight Festival overseas. And so, yeah, you've got it's just such a great potpourri of all the different, musical genres that had come before. And then you're also seeing the birth of punk and Led Zeppelin and, what they're going to do with, what will later kind of be called classic rock. But, at the time was just what rock.
Yeah, and I go back to My Way real quick. It is just a
Yeah.
little Texas tie-in. One of those 2 bonus tracks that were included on that 40th anniversary reissue was a performance of My Way from Reunion Arena.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
What about Texas? What about Texas albums? We've got a few, right?
Well, one more. I just want to mention one more of these
Yeah,
guys coming back and releasing a pretty great song after they had done the bulk of what they're known for, and that's BB King. The Thrill Is Gone came out in 1969, which you think would have thought that song would have already come out, but so he's still doing blues and his thing. So I think Muddy Waters released music in 1969. So he had so many great artists that had already come before still releasing music. This is like a magical unicorn year for music.
Yeah.
So, sorry, just wanted to touch on that. But
Muddy Waters released his 6th album, After the Rain, which featured Ramblin' Mind and Rollin' and Tumblin'. 2 of the bigger tracks off that one. But yeah,
We're going to have to start a new game, like 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. We'll do 6 Degrees of U2. And BB King would have been a lot quicker and more direct link because he actually did a song with them, right?
Yes, at Tarrant County. It was when Graham mentioned Reunion, that reminds me. Oh yeah, I want to make sure and talk about BB King, but I mean, it was a couple decades away from playing with U2. So
6 Degrees of U2 going forward.
I mean, I'm just going through my list again. There's just so many that we still even haven't mentioned. I mean, the Kinks, Arthur, the Decline and Fall of the British Empire. I mean, Cream's last album, Goodbye, which featured 3 live songs and 3 studio songs.
And Blind Faith's first and only album, so you have Eric Clapton and forget another guy from Cream.
Saw that album today for $600.
Yeah. Was it the controversial cover? Okay. The US had a different cover for sure than they did overseas.
Genesis debut album.
That's right.
From Genesis to Revelation. Which, I mean, it doesn't sound a lot like the Genesis, that would come later. And they actually it wasn't a real big success. And they kind of took some time off for a while before they kind of came back and started recording again. But you can hear it if you listen to it. You can hear kind of what Peter Gabriel had to offer and what he would become, and down the road on at least some of the songs on there. Some of them not so much, but you listen to a song like In the Wilderness on there, and it sounds like Peter Gabriel enough to where you're like, yeah, this guy's got something for sure.
Here's a question for you. Song came out and an album came out related to Pulp Fiction in 1969.
Fiction.
Dusty Springfield, son of a preacher man.
That's right.
Yeah. So I have the Velvet Underground's self-titled 3rd album, Joni Mitchell, our sophomore album, Clouds, which David Crosby produced and Stephen Stills plays on. That one won a Grammy for Best Vocal Performance. Chelsea Morning off that one is one of my favorite Joni Mitchell songs. Yeah, it's just...
Yeah. The band releases an album as well, and The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down is the bigger songs off of that album.
That.
So that's the band that played with Bob Dylan.
Right.
For those who don't know, so they kind of went off and did their thing and were very successful. So that was a big year for them as well.
The Who's rock opera masterpiece, Tommy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's huge. Huge.
Y'all mentioned The Doors, South Parade.
Yeah.
That was pretty big with Touch Me. I mean, they had a pretty big hit on that album. Did you mention Pink Floyd, Graham?
No, not yet. It's on here though.
Yeah, Pink Floyd's another classic rock artist, band.
Yeah, that was a movie soundtrack called More.
Yep.
But it was the first album recorded by the band after Syd Barrett's departure, though. So.
Funny, when I was compiling this list, I put three artists I wrote three artists down that I didn't want to talk about that put albums out.
Uh-oh.
And those artists, I know a lot of people will want to talk about them. Elvis being one of them.
Oh yeah, I didn't. I saw that. I didn't put it on my list either.
Captain Beefheart, I think you might have mentioned that earlier. And then Leonard Cohen. But I'm not going to talk about this.
We appreciate you not.
I mean, Leonard Cohen. I mean, it's pretty great. But Yes's debut album.
Yep.
Santana, his self-titled album came out. Like Carpenter's debut album, Ticket to Ride. But yeah, I mean, Bob Marley and the Wailers, their debut album, Soul Shipper, came out. Oh man, there's a lot. The Charlatans, who I mean are not a big band that I think a lot of people know about, but I think they were highly influential in that San Francisco Hyde-Ashbury scene, during the 60s, and they inspired and influenced a lot of those other artists. So that album, which was really their first and only album, it came out in 1969.
It's funny to look up a lot of the hit songs of that year and that era. I mean, it was very, I know the term hippie came out of the late 1960s, but
yeah,
very hippie-ish. A lot of, the song Dawning of the Age of Aquarius.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big hit that year. Man, there's so many. Some of the Beatles songs, I guess you could probably say, are hippie as well, from Yellow Submarine. But yeah, it's just kind of interesting when you go back and look at all the hits from that year.
Yeah, I don't think we've mentioned the Isley Brothers and It's Your Thing. Yeah, to definitely mention them as part of that conversation of soul and how big that was going to be over the 70s. That is a great track for sure. But yeah, going back to the hippie thing, 1969 is the year of Woodstock, and that's kind of the culmination of the hippie vision of peace and love, and that was attended by over 400,000 people, and it wasn't a free concert. It was so they were paying the ticket prices of the day, which are great prices compared to now. But yeah, they and they're getting together in a field and they're listening to music. There's rain delays. You've got Jimi Hendrix having to play in the morning because of the delays, and by the time he gets on there, I think the crowds have started to leave because it's actually pushed on to past the original time frame that they were going to do it, because he pushed it into the morning. But yeah, just incredible, all these different festivals. But I do want to touch on the Altamont Festival that the Rolling Stones wanted to do a free concert, kind of like a West Coast Woodstock, but they made management, probably more than them, made a error in hiring the Hells Angels for their security for the event, and made another error in asking them how they wanted to be paid, and they said they like beer. Bringing it back to beer on the podcast, and how maybe don't pay people with beer if they're going to be doing security at your event. Maybe don't hire like a pretty violent group of people to do your security. But yeah, so if you don't know, that ends in a concert goer being murdered, but he was probably going to do something bad. So there is footage that was caught of him with a gun, so they probably stopped something from happening. But at the end of the day, someone gets murdered at a concert, and it's supposed to be the West Coast Woodstock. It's pretty much a far cry from it. And so that was kind of where the year ends up, is how did we go from there to this? And a lot of people pinpoint it as the when the hippie peace and love era died, and then you go into the 70s and it's little different. There's still hippies, but not nearly like in the 60s. And we had the Manson murders in 1969 as well. That happened before Woodstock, but he was a folk musician, Charles Manson. So it's just a really really interesting time in history. If you just wanted to do like a history podcast, this year would be definitely one of the ones you'd feature and talk about. But definitely with everything going on, felt like a interesting and fun year to pick for, at least fun to talk about, not always fun events. But yeah, I think on that note, do we want to talk about some notable deaths in 1969?
Yeah, for sure. I was actually grabbing at straws trying to find some real positive stuff that happened outside of the music festivals that occurred. But for me personally, I wanted to call out that Sesame Street debuted. Being a kid of the 1970s, that was a morning staple for me and was actually very influential in music as well. That was part of the show, was singing. And I can remember, I can still to this day sing that song if you really want me to, guys.
Absolutely. The floor is yours.
Can you tell me how to get to Sesame Street?
But before we move on to deaths, I do want to mention one more kind of notable event. And
Yeah.
Coy, you and I were kind of talking about this a little bit before we started rolling, but 1969 was the last year in which the United States government gave greater financial support through the National Endowment for the Arts music program to opera than it did to other classical music. And it was the first year in which it gave any support at all to jazz and folk music. Yeah, so kind of a turning point, like you were saying, and just coming out of that decade into the next decade of kind of how things were going in terms of music and popular music and what was, being supported. So,
yeah, thank you for reminding me of that and Sesame Street. Those are both big. Education and arts,
Yes.
should be not separated. They should always be together. So.
Well, we did unfortunately lose, several people that year. And there's two notable ones too that I think stand out in terms of names that people will recognize and know pretty much across, all sectors, all platforms. The first one to me that was the most impactful, I think, was, the guitarist for the Rolling Stones. So Brian Jones unfortunately drowned in his swimming pool that year. And he was, I think, he was in his 20s, right? He was only like 27 years old, I believe. So we lost him. And then, Wizard of Oz, Judy Garland passed away in 1969 as well. And I think a lot of people would say she probably would be number one in terms of just being recognized and being the most famous. But outside of Brian Jones and Judy Garland, a couple others that we lost, a gentleman by the name of Frederick Long, also known as Shorty Long, he was real popular in the 1960s for a song, and it was actually a comedy skit as well, that he used to say, "Here comes the judge." It was on a pretty popular comedy show. I think it's Josh Waite, a blues, folk, and gospel singer. Jack Kerouac's a pretty big one, who was really a poet and an author, part of the Beat generation, but very influential, I think, in music. He influenced a lot of artists in terms of how they wrote and their lyrics. And then Wilmore Jones, also known as Slick Jones, who's always cited as being one of the best drummers of all time. He was a pretty famous jazz drummer, from early on, 1940s through the 1960s. So did you guys have any others that were notable that you wanted to call out?
I just have one, and I don't have a whole lot of information or know a whole lot about him, but his name is Paul Chambers, and he was a pioneering jazz bassist. I think was just real influential in that changing jazz sound at the time. But he passed away due to tuberculosis.
It's crazy that, some of the things, when you go back this far, you're like, wow, tuberculosis was still like a thing. Yeah, I saw that too.
Yeah.
It's wild. But yeah, Noah, you covered, there were a lot of deaths, but those were the notable ones that I had seen as well. But on a brighter note, how was music impacted by some births in 1969? So these are people that are going to be born. They're going to be listening to the music that from this year and that was inspired by this year, and it's going to shape, what they come up with. So what did you guys see there?
This list is long, so I'll just pick a few, and then I'll let you guys kind of chime in as well, because I mean, we probably have a lot of the same ones. But one of the biggest ones that jumped out at me right away is Dave Grohl, drummer from Nirvana and obviously frontman for The Foo Fighters, he was born January 14th. Mariah Carey, born 3/27. Obviously would go on to have a huge career in pop music and drive us all crazy every year at Christmas with that one song. Ice Cube was born 6/15. Rapper Ice Cube. This one's might have flown on the radar for some people, but I probably not for you, John. Chan Kinchala, guitarist for Blues Traveler.
Well, I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, he was born 5/29. Elliott Smith,
Yep.
who was born August 6th. And then, of course, passed away and left us in 2003. Gwen Stefani was born in October. Jacob Dylan of the Wallflowers, and obviously Bob Dylan's son, was born in December. What about you guys? What do y'all have on your list?
Yeah, not one of my personal favorites, but I think he left a mark on the industry. Marilyn Manson was born in January, as well as Dutch DJ Tiesto, who's pretty popular in the EDM world and has actually had some crossover pop hits as well. Bobby Brown, married to Whitney Houston, an American R&B singer, and he was with the group New Edition as well as solo. How about you?
I got a long list,
Yeah.
and I'm not going to name them all.
Buckethead, the guitarist for Guns N' Roses after Slash.
Who was it?
Buckethead.
Oh, Buckethead.
uh-huh.
Yeah, I
Yep.
did have him on my
Yep.
list. Yeah. Another guitarist, though, Rich Robinson, Chris's brother from the Black Crowes. He actually was born in 1969. One that's a personal favorite of mine because I spent so much time up in the Pacific Northwest. But Toby Vale from Bikini Kill. She was born in 1969. Matt Sharp, who actually got his start with Weezer, but then
That's right.
went off to the Rentals. He also was another one that was born in 69. PJ Harvey, and I'm not going to say anything about Baby Oil. Yeah, P. Diddy, he was born, Jay-Z was born in 1969, and actually two members of NWA, not just Ice Cube, Graham, but MC Ren as well, was born
Yeah.
in 1969.
Well, and also, if I'm not mistaken, another member of Weezer was also born in 1969, Patrick Wilson.
Yep.
Oh,
Yeah.
I did not know
Which,
that.
I mean, makes sense. They're probably going to be around the same age. So,
Well, Graham,
Yeah,
you're
like Jennifer Lopez and Mark Anthony, who were once married, were both born 1969.
oh, and
I
John,
like
I can't believe you haven't shouted. Are you done or?
no. Well, I know you're a New Kids on the Block fan, so you're.
Yes, Donnie Wahlberg and Danny, whatever his last name. I think were both born in 1969.
I can't believe you didn't remember Danny Wood,
Danny Wood,
being such a big fan.
huge fan. When I was
Yes.
10. But yeah, what about Scarface, man?
Yeah, I was gonna say a lot of rappers that we haven't gotten to yet.
Ghetto Boys.
Yeah.
Oh, I missed it,
Hey, you
Yeah.
missed it, man.
dude.
Master P, of course, another rapper.
Wyclef Jean, Jay-Z,
Yep.
white rapper Snow, who had a
Mhm.
hit shortly after Vanilla Ice did, but that's probably all worth mentioning
And-
for him.
Another one that's no longer with us and passed away in 2019. The Prodigy's Keith Flint.
Yes.
He was born in September.
Tenacious D.
What?
Tenacious D. Jack Black.
Oh, Jack Black.
No,
See,
Yeah.
69. Very nice.
It's funny. A lot of the people that we talked about in the 91 and the 2001 music episodes were born this year. And I did not do that on purpose. This was the last thing I looked at, and I'd already decided and was like, wow, this is really going to tie in nicely.
Kelvin Mercer of De La Soul, John.
Oh, nice.
August. Yes.
I don't think we mentioned Pat Monahan, lead singer of Train. He was born in 69.
Graham Coxon. I just want to put him in there because we share a name and Blur's pretty cool. So he's the singer, songwriter for Blur.
Oh, nice.
More artists or bands we talked about on those other
Yep.
episodes. Crazy. It all comes full circle.
It
But I wanted to highlight, if we're done with births, I was going to mention one other thing, and I think we need to circle back on Texas music as well.
We do.
So I found it really interesting with all the rap on here. that there was the thing that pushed it over for me when I saw that this came out in 1969 and why I really wanted to talk about it. Do you guys know the song Amen Brother? That came
Not
out.
ringing a bell.
Alrighty. So Amen Brother, you're gonna know a specific drum break from this song more than you're gonna know the song. But it's a band called the Winstons, and it's you would know the song, you've probably heard it as a church song, but it's just that Amen. Amen.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Amen. Amen. So this version is pretty cool. It's the Winstons are singing it, and it's got, a pretty good beat to it. But then there is a drum break. I think it's 7 seconds where it's just the drums playing. And that 7 seconds of drums would get isolated and looped and become the most sampled piece of music in history.
Oh, wow.
It appears in hundreds and hundreds of songs, especially hip hop and rap. And it's called the Amen Break because it came from that song, Amen Brother. So if you want to do a little light reading or fun study up on something that's pretty interesting, yeah, just look up the Amen Break. And then I think on Spotify you can go and find, like, people have done playlists of all the songs that have the Amen Break in it. And let me see if I can just find a few here.
Straight out of Compton. That drum break and Straight Out of Compton.
Yep. Even the Futurama theme song has it. And if you once you hear the drums from that, you will be like, oh yeah, this is you've heard it a lot of places. Let's see here. I Desire by Salt and Pepper. Yeah, Straight Outta Compton has it. There's some Linkin Park, Prodigy, Slipknot has used it. Tyler the Creator has used it. Aphex Twin. So yeah, like, EDM dance, obviously going to sample it too. Anything that uses sampling is going to use it. But yeah, Lady Gaga has used it. Snow, Informer, that we just mentioned, he was born the year that song came out, used it in that song.
Wow.
But yeah, when you hear it, you can just think of these guys probably, growing up, heard that song, playing in their neighborhoods around the house. And when it got to that part, they were probably like, whoa, I just need to, like, loop that while I come up with, like, my rhymes and lyrics and stuff. So I just thought that was a really interesting footnote in history for this year. I knew the Amen Break. I did not know it, or I had forgotten that it came, was released in 1969, at least the song that it came from. So I just thought that was really cool. Fun fact that ties
Very cool. Yeah.
all of the musical tapestry. So it kind of goes along with these births. It was birthed that year. A lot of these people were born that year, and it birthed, that kind of genre took off from there. But
Yeah, that is a very interesting note. Thank you, Corey. I'll have to check that out. But we do need to circle back around on Texas albums. But before I do that, if I may, I do want to just mention one more non-Texas album, but I think it's pretty huge, and it's received so much just critical praise throughout the years, and it's inspired, I think, a lot of singer-songwriters. So I think we would be remiss to not mention Nick Drake's album 5 Leaves Left.
Yeah.
It's regularly on just list of, like, greatest albums of all time. It's always on those lists when you go back and look at them. 100 greatest debut albums in Uncut in 2006. Yeah, debut albums that changed music in Q magazine. I mean, the list is just like an arm's length long of just like how many honors it has received on all of those, top albums of all time lists. So, and I think it was just really huge in forming that sound. And his voice was so unique that he just really stood out from the pack with his style. So yeah, I just want to make sure we got that one in there as well.
Yeah, he was in my notes and on my list. So thank you. I missed him and meant to mention that one too, as well as thinking of the Amen Break also reminded me that James Brown released music in 1969. So that's part of that conversation we were having about those artists who were still releasing music, even though they're not like really the ones you think about when you think about this year or this era. But it was, again, just there are so many layers of tapestry to this year that it's so many great artists.
And just a few Texas albums. I'll start with what I would say probably the biggest one from a Texas artist, which would be Townes Van Zandt. His second studio album, Our Mother the Mountain. considered to be one of the greatest recordings and features some of his best known works. Songs like Be Here to Love Me, Snake Mountain Blues, and Our Mother the Mountain. Like most albums that Towns released, and they did not sell very well in his lifetime. I think a lot of people have discovered him, later on and kind of have gone back to him since that time. But yeah, that album just kind of reinforced his reputation as a songwriter. The kind of artist that inspires the other artists that we do know, very well, and who, go on to great commercial success. So I think a lot of those artists we may not have if it weren't for Towns. So I wanted to mention his album for sure. You had Waylon Jennings releasing his 10th album, Just to Satisfy You, which reached number 7 on the country albums charts. Also contains the top 5 duet hit, I Got You, which was recorded with Anita Carter from the Carter family. Did y'all have any Texas ones? I think I might have one more.
I believe Willie Nelson released music in 1969 as well. Not one of his better known or more successful ones, but it was his last with RCA and his last before he transitioned like Waylon and a lot of the other artists from this time to outlaw country sound of the 70s. It's kind of the last classic clean cut country from Willie and,
Right.
Waylon.
Also, Jerry Jeff Walker's follow-up to his album, Mr. Bojangles, which was a big one, but his follow-up to that, Drifting Way of Life, that album came out in 69 as well. And of course, we already mentioned Sly and the Family Stone in the non-Texas section, but he, is a native Texan as well.
Yeah.
So hats off to those native Texans in the group.
Yeah, Chris Christopherson didn't release. I don't think he released music in 69, but he was definitely writing music, and he was the infamous helicopter landing on Johnny Cash's property happened in this year. The legendary, I should say, more than infamous. So we covered that in our episode where we did a little tribute to him. So this is where he and Johnny start writing together, and Johnny releases some of his music in 1970, and then of course Chris Christopherson also starts releasing music then too. So an important year in that it leads to a lot of Chris Christopherson. I think he might have starred in his first movie in 1969, or not starred, but appeared in a movie for the first time.
Right.
Which of course
started his acting career.
Yeah.
Okay. Very cool.
But worth noting that Texan there. But
I do have an interesting little tidbit here. So there was an album that was released actually in 1974, but it's a recording of the Velvet Underground in 1969. It's called the Velvet Underground Live, and almost half of that live album was recorded in Dallas, Texas.
Oh, okay.
At a venue. It was actually called End of Cole Avenue was the name of the venue. So half of that album was actually recorded right here, but
that's cool.
Was not released until a few years later, but it was recorded in 69.
Hey, that counts. I did not know that.
I believe Janis Joplin also released music in 19.
Oh, yes,
I think it was her first solo album where she wasn't with the band that she was with.
Yeah.
I got them old cosmic blues again, mama.
Yes.
Good album.
Okay. Wow. I mean, 1969. Yes. Very, very good choice, Coy. Thanks for all your research, both you guys, and bringing that to the episode today. I mean, it's been fun just going back and looking at all these, great artists and great releases and all the stuff that was going on then, both, culturally and politically, and all the stuff that just had a huge impact on the years to come. But yeah, and we appreciate you guys watching and listening, or however it is that you consume Texas Tracks and Taps. We thank you for it, and we would urge you and encourage you and thank you and appreciate it if you would like and subscribe and follow and share and do all the things that'll keep you connected with us and get the word out if you are enjoying listening to us, that other people could maybe find us as well. And I did want to say too, these episodes on years have been just so jam-packed that we've kind of gotten away from some of our standard procedures as far as our episodes go, which are the assignments that we handed out and followed up on, and we are going to get back to that. So with our next episode, we will follow up on the last assignment we gave, which was David Ramirez, and also assign a new assignment. So looking forward to that. Stay tuned. And yeah, thank you guys and appreciate you. And until next time.
Don't forget Neil Diamond and Sweet Caroline.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Sweet Caroline.
Got to end on that
Bum,
note.
bum, bum.
Oh yeah, and there's the Shiner.
Yeah.
On.
Cheers.
Yeah. Thanks, Shiner.
Can you tell me how to get to Sesame Street? That's the outro.